Centre for Public Christianity, you're listening to Life and Faith. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
Now, I don't know if you noticed or not, but last week was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, the split of the Western Church into Catholic and Protestant. And to mark the occasion, CPX was part of a forum hosted by Sydney Ideas and The Spirit of Things, an ABC Radio National program. And this was the question posed to a panel of experts. What was the X factor that gave Martin Luther an edge in changing the most powerful organisation in 16th century Europe?
The odds were certainly against Luther. The Catholic Church, which was the church at the time in Western Europe, very much had the resources and the opportunity to shut down the ideas of a small-town monk. And they'd done it before. Jan Hus was a Czech priest, and he's often thought of as the first reformer. He was executed in 1415, more than a century earlier. But somehow, not only did Luther live a long life, his ideas survived, even thrived. There's not much in the modern Western world, democracy, universal education, that didn't stem, at least in part, from Luther's Reformation.
So on our show, we have a highlights reel of this conversation, but you can listen to the full event on the Spirit of Things website and podcast. The forum was moderated by Rachel Conn, who is the host of The Spirit of Things, and on the panel, Mark Worthing from Adelaide. He's a Lutheran minister and professor. Also, Michael Jensen, a theologian and an Anglican minister in Sydney. Kristina Keneally, the 42nd Premier of New South Wales, now a political commentator on Sky News Australia. And Carole Cusack, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Sydney. She trained as a medievalist, but now works on contemporary religious trends.
Later, we'll hear from the panellists on the implications of the Reformation today, because 500 years is a very long time. Do Luther's ideas still resonate? But first, we wanted to start with this X factor question. What was it that made Luther's Reformation so successful?
Let's start with Mark Worthing.
Mark, your book is called A Wild Boar in the Lord's Vineyard. Now, was that Martin Luther's reputation at the time?
It certainly was. That was what the Pope had referred to him as, and a document that he wrote condemning him, and that was how he pictured him, as a wild boar that had broken into a neatly guarded vineyard and just run amok. He was seen as a personality that was a bit dangerous, out of control, unpredictable. His personality, the combination of factors of being a good communicator, passionate, stubborn, belligerent, extraordinarily intelligent, all played a role. If any of those weren't there, he probably would not have been able to succeed as well as he did in what actually happened.
Can you give us a bit of an example of how he expressed himself?
Probably not on air, but he was known for his colorful language. And when he engaged with his adversaries, he often came up with very colorful names for them. So when he got angry, you could tell he was angry. But when he was passionate and cared, he was also very loving and concerned about ordinary people and their suffering and their lives. So they sensed, here's someone that's intelligent, that knows what's going on, but he's not putting on airs. He speaks in a language we can understand.
So why was he so interested in the common tongue?
He was interested in common people. Unlike many of his day who made it that far in academia, he was actually born of peasant stock, and he never forgot that. So he wanted to speak truths that ordinary people could understand. Otherwise, he felt, what's the point?
And of course, that would involve the translation of the Bible into German.
Eventually, because if the common people couldn't read for themselves what all the discussion was about, how could they ever decide? And he felt the common people couldn't just be told, you must believe this, you must believe that. They had to weigh up the arguments for themselves. And since these arguments weighed heavily upon what the scripture actually said, they had to have it in their language.
While it's Luther's actions that we think of as sparking the Reformation, actually we could say that Luther's ideas developed and spread in the context of many Reformations. In England, John Wycliffe had already come up against the church. He criticised indulgences, like Luther, and translated the Bible into English. But there was no printing press yet, so his Bible was only available in manuscript form.
Now, this Bible is distributed quite widely. There's still 250 copies of this Wycliffite Bible, and you can buy one for the small matter of 1.6 million US, I think. The trouble was for Wycliffe that he was associated with the Peasants' Revolt, And so his act of translating the Bible and everything else besides became seen as seditious and revolutionary. And so translating the Bible in England became an act of treason, a banned act.
Yes, I mean, why was that? I mean, Wycliffe was fortunate because he died of a stroke, but poor old William Tyndale had a more dramatic end.
Yes, so in the 1530s, he was eventually hunted down by King Henry, who ironically had already licensed the translation of a Bible into English, but he had tried through the 1520s, under the influence of Luther's teachings, he's probably the Englishman most influenced by Luther's teachings, to translate the Bible so that the ploughboy, he said, would have the Bible in his own tongue.
Okay, but did the ploughboy and the milkmaid express an interest in having a Bible?
Not until much later, partly because Bibles are very expensive to produce at this time. It isn't until the 1560s that the Geneva Bible is produced in a cheap form. It's the first mass-produced printed book in English. That is taken up, and we know that there were some 300,000 copies printed in the 80 years after 1560. When you think of the levels of literacy and the cost of books, that's quite a remarkable story.
So would you say the Bible is the X factor in the Reformation?
Well, I would as the formal principle, but it's the material principle of the Reformation is actually the teaching that Luther found in his study of the Bible. In his view, the Bible was teaching justification by faith alone, that we are saved not by merit, not by tapping down on a store of the church's blessings that you could get, or grace that you could get from the church through the sacramental system, but by believing. That was then a verbal and cognitive act and a heart act. And Luther used to say, look, the ears alone are the organ of the Christian. People need to hear the Word of God. They need to read it. They need to understand it so they can then believe it. So therefore, the Bible needed to be printed and given because of that change in how one comes to know God.
Now, Kristina Keneally was the only person of Catholic faith on the panel, and it's fair to say that Luther was not a big player in her upbringing or education.
Does Luther figure much in your life? I mean, was he talked about?
No. Growing up as an American Catholic child, Catholic primary school, Catholic high school, Catholic university, Catholic family, Catholic parish, everyone I knew was Catholic. The only Martin Luther we knew was Martin Luther King. And this notion that there was somebody else named Martin Luther was just confusing. If we knew anything, like I have a vague memory in childhood that there was this guy who nailed some stuff on a church door, and that was why he got in trouble, because he desecrated the church door.
Well, that brings to mind, are there Catholics in the contemporary world who, in a sense, are modern-day Luthers, who were known as prophetic voices, who still are, who denounced various teachings in the current church? I mean, are there parallels that you could identify?
Look, there is that impulse within Catholicism, there always has been. That's the whole definition of theology, faith-seeking understanding. So I do think those voices exist. Whether or not you would go as far to say that they exist in Pope Francis today, I don't know that I would, but I would say that in Pope Francis you do have someone who is returning the Church to the spirit of Vatican II, which is that the Church is not here, as Pope Francis says, to replace consciences, but to help form them. And I think in that sense there is an element of Martin Luther.
And there were other factors at play here, social factors, technologies that made it the right time and the right place for Luther. Here's Carole Cusack.
The invention of the printing press has already been mentioned, and that can't be underestimated. And one of the things that happens with the printing press is that it spurs literacy. There is a greater level of education, particularly amongst middle-class people who live within towns, not so much amongst agrarian peasants, but certainly townsfolk. To be in possession of books and a Bible was a tremendously important thing.
Cusack also says that the world was a lot bigger than it had ever been before.
Luther dies in 1546, and it's worth pointing out that by that time, Francis Xavier is in Japan. The Jesuits are already happening. They've been to Goa, they've been to China, they've been to Macau, they've been to Malacca. It means that a lot of the kind of steady state view of the eternal verities of the Catholic Church, the idea that the peasant is in his field ploughing and he can't ever do anything else, are being overturned by a world where immense change is coming in. It's the equivalent to us being told that in 30 years, 80% of jobs will be gone and drones will be delivering our mail and, various nanobots will be curing our diseases. These sorts of stories came into everybody's life.
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. We are bringing you highlights from the X Factor in the Reformation, a forum hosted by Sydney Ideas and The Spirit of Things from the ABC to mark the 500th anniversary of the Reformation.
It's not uncommon to describe the Reformation as an event that changed the world. But does it still have teeth today? Our world is also bigger again than it was in Luther's day, and diversity or pluralism is a hallmark of our communities. Carole Cusack explains how Reformation ideas translate to this world.
One of the things that we have inherited, the secular world inherits from Christianity, is the notion that actually human beings, the way they are every day, are imperfect and they need to be improved and perfected. So we work on making ourselves better people, making our societies more just. We work on having better communication with those that we don't agree with or who believe different things. We're on a perpetual, I think, journey of improvement. And I see that as very much a secular inheritor of the idea that a Christian must continually strive towards virtue and to be godly.
Luther lived on the border between the medieval and the modern. And one of the big ideas that was part of this shift, an important one for modern democracies, is the separation of church and state. Here's Mark Worthing.
He put forward a new model. Instead of saying the churchly authority had two swords, one to rule the world and one to rule the church, he said God had two kingdoms. There's a kingdom of the church, the spiritual one, and the secular one. Both served God, but they were both different. And they need to respect their separate areas. So it was wrong, for instance, for the church to ask the state to enforce physical penalties on people for theological misbelief or wrongdoing. He accelerated the interest in education, in reading. He worked very hard to get communities, secular communities, towns and councils to establish schools and to support them financially. He saw all these people who were now leaving monasteries with good education and said, think about being school teachers. He saw vocation differently and said a calling isn't just a calling to be a priest or nun or a monk, but it's to be a mother or a father or a carpenter or a milkmaid. In that sense, he probably did bring a greater separation between church and state and a greater lifting up and appreciation of the secular as something that was not an absence of God, but just God working in a different way than in the church. And 500 years on, it's not just the fact that there's not just one large Catholic Christian community that's different. Culturally, linguistically, educational systems, all sorts of changes were prompted in what happened beginning in 1517 and carried on through other reformers and through Catholic reforms that we often forget about. That's made the world a very different place in many ways than it would have been otherwise, even for those who never set foot in the door of either Catholic or Protestant churches.
From the Centre for Public Christianity, you've been listening to Life and Faith with Simon Smart and Natasha Moore. It was great to be part of this forum, the X Factor in the Reformation, hosted by Sydney Ideas and ABC's The Spirit of Things.
If you want to listen to the whole discussion, and it's a great one, we've only been able to give you a few highlights here, go to the Spirit of Things website or look it up in your podcast player. Just type The Spirit of Things into the search box to find the program. We'll have links to this on our website, publicchristianity.org, and on our Facebook page.
Next week, the Museum of the Bible has just opened in Washington, DC. And we sat down with a couple of the architects of this project when they were in Sydney last year.
And so our goal is that people will walk through that floor and just go, oh, wow, I never knew that. I never experienced that. I never thought about that coming from the Bible before.